You'll notice I have filled in some blanks for you. If you'll look at the handout first that says confusion. You should have two handouts stapled together. The first one says confusion. Let's just read through this quickly. After the flood, God commanded man to scatter abroad, to replenish and to fill the earth. In Genesis 11:1-9, man rebelled, and under their world leader Nimrod, decided to construct a tower that would reach into the heavens. And you will remember that I explained to you, these people weren't foolish enough to think that they could build a tower into outer space. That's not what they're trying to do. They're not trying to build a tower into heaven as we know it so that they can step off of the tower and see God. But rather, this is a tower that was erected for two reasons. Number one, for idol worship. In particular, they were worshiping a man by the name of Nimrod, who was the first emperor god to come into existence. And then secondly, for the study of astrology, which is a perversion of astronomy. Astronomy is a valid science, but astrology is an attempt to seek guidance from the position of the stars and the planets, and it is an attempt to seek guidance apart from God. And so that was the purpose of this tower. Number three, what was God's response? God came down and confounded the languages of the people so that they could not understand each other. Well, real quickly, let's read about that. Genesis chapter 11. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they all have one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. Now, last week, if you'll turn your handout over, I began giving you 5 things that begin with the letter M that these people had done wrong. And this is an addendum to what we studied the last time I went through this several years ago. This is extra material that was not included a few years ago when we first went through this study together. Just real quickly, by way of review, the people had the wrong motive. Notice what it says in verse 11. Verse 11, and the whole earth, chapter 11. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Now, that location is modern-day Iraq. This was the original location of Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq. And beginning in 1922, they started excavating the ancient ruins of Babylon. And the ancient ruins of Babylon are among the most excavated ruins on earth today. And the things that they have found in ancient Babylon have been absolutely incredible. One of the things they found in ancient Babylon was an actual tower that had been constructed. Probably not the Tower of Babel, but maybe a replica of the Tower of Babel. The interesting thing about this tower, as I told you last week, it was 400 feet wide at its base, and it was 153 feet high. It was built in 7 sections, which would correspond with the 7 known planets at that time. Each of these various layers was a different color. Black to correspond with Saturn, red to correspond with Mars, orange to correspond with Jupiter, and so on and so forth. There was a summit on the top of this tower, and in the stone of that summit, they found carved the signs of the zodiac, which are still used in astrology today. And so that's the location that we're dealing with here. We're dealing with modern-day Iraq. We're dealing with ancient Babylon. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and slime they had for mortar. Now watch this. They said, Go to, let us build a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the earth. You'll notice in that verse, it's we, us, us, us. They were not doing this for the glory of God. They were doing this for the glory of man. And so their motive was wrong. And then I explained to you last week that the materials that they used was wrong. Again, notice what it says in verse number 3. And they said one to another, "Go to and let us make brick and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. Now, here they are trying to reach God, or trying to reach the heavens with brick and mortar. And I explained to you last week that in a sense, men are doing the same thing today. Rather than trusting in God, we're trusting in our own minds. We're trusting in our own technology. We're trusting in so-called science. And that's the brick and mortar of today. And so many people are trying to reach the heavens today with the wrong materials, just as they were trying to reach the heavens with the wrong materials. Number 3, they had the wrong mentality. And I explained to you last week that this place here is the birthplace, listen, it is the birthplace of humanism. This is the birthplace of humanism. And last week I read to you this definition. Humanism is the viewpoint that human happiness is its own justification and requires no sanction or support from supernatural sources. And you remember last week I gave you the 4 pillars of humanism. If you did not write them down tonight. These are the 4 pillars of humanism. Number 1, atheism. And I gave you a lengthy quote on that from Dr. Cloris Lamont last week, who is a very well-known humanist, one of the world's most well-known humanists. I won't take time to reread that. Number 2, evolution. Since the humanist has decided there is no God, they have to explain man's existence apart from God. Number 3 is amorality, no fixed standard of right and wrong. And since man is just an animal, then all he must be concerned about is self-preservation and self-propagation. And then number 4, we said that the 4th pillar is the deification of man. Forget God, forget heaven, just be happy. That's the humanist motto. Their catchword is happy. And I closed last week, and that's the chief goal, the happiness of man. And I closed last week by saying to you that we have been so brainwashed in humanism in our culture today that even if you ask many Christian parents, what is your primary goal for your children, what do they almost always say without exception? I just want my children to be happy. And yet, according to a biblical worldview, that is not God's ultimate goal for our lives, nor should it be our ultimate goal for our children. God's ultimate goal for our lives is not our happiness, but our what? Our holiness. And sometimes they don't necessarily go hand in hand. Certainly God's not against us being happy. But sometimes happiness and holiness, as we saw in the book of Daniel, do not necessarily go hand in hand. And it's been a long time since I've heard a parent say, all I want for my children, I don't care what they do, don't care where they live, all I really am concerned about for my children, all I want for them is that they be holy. And certainly we want our kids to be happy, but the primary consideration from God's perspective and from a biblical worldview is that we be conformed to the image of His Son, according to Romans chapter 8. Now, what I want to do tonight is give you these last 2, and then if we have time, we'll look a little bit at the call of Abraham. I want you to write down under number 4, they had the wrong method. They had the wrong method. And I want you to notice what it says in verse number 4. We're talking now again, we're continuing to look at the Tower of Babel. Notice what it says in verse number 4. And they said, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." And the Lord, well, let's stop right there. Now, here's their method. Are you listening? Their method was to build from the ground up. This is a perfect illustration of man-made religion, trying to reach God from the ground up. In other words, man's attempt to reach God. And that's really what all man-made religion is. Christianity is the only religion, and I put that in quotes, that does not teach that man should strive to reach God, but that God, in His grace, has reached down to man. You can take all the religions of the world and put them in one category. It's man trying to reach God, and primarily trying to reach God by good works. Christianity stands alone in that it is not man trying to reach God. It is God by grace reaching down to man. Many years ago, I heard this song at a Bible conference, and I've never forgotten it. It touched my heart. The title of the song is He Came to Me. And it illustrates perfectly what I'm talking about right now. So I want to read the words. It says, the gulf that separated me from Christ my Lord, it was so vast, the crossing I could never ford. From where I was to his demands, it seemed so far. I cried, dear Lord, I cannot come to where you are. Chorus says, He came to me. He came to me. When I could not come to where he was, he came to me. That's why he died on Calvary. When I could not come to where he was, he came to me. And so the first thing that we see here is a picture under the wrong method. The first thing we see here is a picture of man-made religion. Man trying to reach God through his own self-effort. The second thing we see here is not only a picture of man-made religion, but we also see a picture of the one world government that is going to come to pass at the end of days. The Bible teaches that this world will end with 7 years of tribulation, during which time there will be a one world government. May I tell you that the nations of this world, listen, the nations of this world are on a greased slide towards a one world government. We are headed that way. And so they were saying in verse 4, look again if you would at verse 4, it says, go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name. Now read this last phrase out loud. Lest we be what? Scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. This is in direct rebellion against what God had told Adam and Noah and his sons. That they should be fruitful and multiply and do what? Replenish the earth and fill the earth. And so this is an attempt on the part of these people to say what we need is to stay together. What we need is collective security. So here's what they said. They said, we're going to organize our lives around this monument, the Tower of Babel. This is what we are going to organize our lives around. Those are the original humanists. Do you know what the humanists organize their life around today? Big government. Centralized government. We must organize our lives around big government. And humanists have a running love affair with big government. Because the humanists believe that the government is the answer to our problems. And that if we are ever going to keep people together, they are going to have to be controlled by a centralized government. And that government is going to have to reach its tentacles into every area of our lives. Big government is a humanist philosophy, and it goes all the way back to the Tower of Babel. In 1980, Ronald Reagan inherited a terrible recession. Interest rates were through the roof. Inflation was through the roof. We were in trouble. I don't know how many of y'all my age, I guess you'd have to just about be my age or older, because we'd just gotten married. You'd just about have to be married and have a family to feel the impact of it. But how many of y'all remember that terrible recession of the late 70s? Well, when Ronald Reagan was inaugurated in January of 81, I want to read what he said. He said this, and I quote, he said, in this present crisis, now watch this now, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. From time to time, we've been tempted to believe that society has become too complex to be managed by self-rule. That government by an elite group is superior to government for, by, and of the people. Then he said, well, if no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else? Now here's my point. That was the prevailing worldview 30 years ago in America. When I say prevailing, I mean at least the majority of Americans believe that. That big government is not the problem, is not the solution, it's the problem. May I tell you, it is not that way anymore. Now the majority of Americans believe that the government should not only protect us, but provide for us. From the cradle to the grave. Now, the old worldview said, just get out of our way. Just get government out of the way and we'll take care of ourselves. But now the cry of the day is, we're not going to leave you out there on your own. Government is going to take care of you. And government has moved from being a protector to being a provider. Now, may I tell you, that's the reason that we are on an unsustainable path of spending. And that's why taxes continue to go up. Listen to this statistic. In 1920, are you listening? In 1920, 1 out of every 100 Americans worked for the government. Local, state, and federal. 1 out of every 100 Americans worked for the government. Now, 1 out of every 6 Americans work for the government. Now, that's a fact. That is a statistic. We're talking local, state, federal. 1 out of 6 Americans draws their paycheck from the taxpayer. And government is growing and growing and growing. And humanists have a romance with big government because they honestly believe that government is the answer. And they have a romance with big government. And it goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 11. 20 years ago, Adrian Rogers said this, and I quote, he said, the secret behind the government of the United States of America, which has granted more freedom for the longest period of time, 200 or more years, is self-government. A government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But friend, that is an idea that is receding over the horizon. And the government is taking over everything. Now, this was 20 years ago, before the health care legislation was even thought about. Health care and education are at the forefront now of the humanist philosophy. They don't believe that you have enough gumption, enough sense to educate your own children. So the Department of Education is taking over so that they can make the public schools the Sunday school classes for the religion of humanism. The humanists, by and large, have a hostility toward Americanism and patriotism and free enterprise. They don't want a strong America. They're calling for disarmament. They call it collective security. All right, in that quote, he mentioned 2 things that the humanists wish to control concerning government. He mentioned education and health care. Let me talk about education first. In Humanist magazine, the humanist author John Dunphy said this in 1983, quote, a visible alternative to Christianity must be sought. That alternative is humanism. I am convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public school classroom by teachers who correctly perceive their role as the proselytizers of a new faith, a religion of humanity that recognizes and respects the spark of what theologians call divinity in every human being. In other words, that man is God. These teachers must embody the same selfless dedication as the most rabid fundamentalist preachers, for they will be ministers of another sort, utilizing a classroom instead of a pulpit to convey humanist values in whatever subject they teach, regardless of the educational level. The classroom must and will become an arena of conflict between the old and the new, the rotting corpse of Christianity, together with all its adjacent evils and misery, and the new faith of humanism. The preface to the humanist book, Humanist Ethic, says this: a large majority of the educators of America and of the Western world are humanist in their outlook. The faculties of American colleges and universities are predominantly humanist. And a majority of the teachers who go out from their studies in the colleges to responsibilities in primary and secondary schools are basically humanist, no matter that they maintain a nominal attachment to church or synagogue for good personal or social or practical reasons. And so that's the first area that the humanist wishes to control, and that's the primary area that they wish to control, is the classroom. Now you may wonder, why is it that a majority of Americans now believe that government is the answer, that government should be a provider rather than a protector? because they have been brainwashed in the classroom in humanism for the last 50 years. Now we are reaping what we have sown. Now, what about health care? Well, if government health care is so good, I have one question. Why did the people that passed it exempt themselves from it? Folks, never look at what a politician says. Always look at what they do. Now look at the screen. Here's an article from CBS News. How many of y'all will agree with me CBS is not a bastion of conservatism? Here's an article from CBS News. For as long as the political fight took over the past year, the abbreviated review process on the health care legislation currently pending on President Obama's desk, now it's passed, is unquestionably going to result in some surprises. As happens with any piece of mashed up legislation, both for the congressman who voted for it and for the American people. Now watch this. One such surprise is found on page 158 of the legislation, which appears to create a carve-out for senior staff members in the leadership offices and on congressional committees, essentially exempting those senior Democrat staffers who wrote the bill from being forced to purchase health care plans in the same way as other Americans. Don't look at what listen, if you think for 1 minute that any politician, Democrat or Republican, is genuinely concerned about your pre-existing condition, then I genuinely believe that you are naive. It's about control. It's about who's going to control your life. It's about extending government tentacles into more and more areas of your life. That's humanism. Now, where's it all heading? Here's my point. It is all heading towards a one-world government. It is all heading towards a one-world government. Let me give you a quote from Cloris Lamont, one of the nation's leading humanists. Nationalism, rooted as it is in arbitrary geographical units, must be superseded by a, what's the next word? Globalism, based on the oneness of man. There must be a worldwide organization to which national sovereignty would be relinquished in all international affairs. The UN has the potential to be effective but cannot achieve the goal envisioned here until all people of the world are represented. What he's saying is that all Americans, all Europeans, and all Asians, we must all put ourselves under the headship of a centralized global government. That we must surrender our sovereignty as a nation. That we must become citizens of the world first and Americans second. So humanists are in love with two things. Number one, big government. Number two, global government. And we see it first in Genesis chapter 11. This is not a Democrat problem. This is not a Republican problem. This is a problem that we have seen on both sides of the aisle. George W. Bush doubled the size of the federal government in spite of his promises to downsize it. Now President Obama wants to double what he doubled. And every time I hear George W. Bush talk about the New World Order, I cringe. Because you can mark it down. The New World Order is nothing more than a code word for a one world government. They had the wrong method. Fifthly, they had the wrong man. Go to chapter 10 and look at verse 8. Chapter 10 and verse 8. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was what? It was Babel. The word Nimrod in Hebrew literally means rebel. That's what the name Nimrod means. It means rebel. And so Nimrod is a picture or a type of the Antichrist. And make no mistake about it, the Tower of Babel was not only a monument to astrology, it was a monument erected to the glory of Nimrod. Not just to the glory of man, but to the glory of Nimrod. I did a little further research on this week, and I discovered that Nimrod, that the actual birthplace of emperor worship, you know, in Japan, for many years, they actually believed that the emperor was divine. And that when he spoke with the voice of God. And this is the birthplace of emperor worship, of actually considering the emperor, a human being, to actually be a deity. This is the birthplace of that. And so what I want to do now for the next few minutes is I want to show you just a short video, and it'll kind of wrap up everything that we've studied on the Tower of Babel. Now, let me just say this. The quality of the video is not the greatest, and it's in two segments. It's a Bible study that was recorded in parts. What I'm showing you is the end of part 6 and then the beginning of part 7, because those were the parts that dealt specifically with the Tower of Babel. So just so you know, that's what you're seeing in this series of videos. You're seeing the end of part 6 and the beginning of part 7, all right? And he just kind of wraps up. I thought this would be a nice bow to put on it. He just kind of wraps up everything that we've talked about concerning the Tower of Babel. So let's dim the lights if we could, please. Here is our conclusion to our study on the Tower of Babel.
The Tower of Babel is often misrepresented in paintings. You'll often see it look something like this. But it was actually a kind of ziggurat, which is a pyramid-like shape. Indeed, from the Babylonian ziggurats we get similar structures in Egypt, Africa and South America, remains of which can still be seen today and are amongst the world's most beloved tourist attractions. The reason that they are this particular shape is that they were built to represent mountains. Satan wants to be like God. He therefore mimics him in every way. The people Satan influences do likewise. Just as Satan wanted to ascend to the mountain of God to become God, the people he influenced were the same. Nimrod built the Tower of Babel to represent a sacred mountain, at the top of which he would have his throne room, his heaven, and he would rule from there not just as a king but as a god. It represents the deification of man, the idea that man can become a god. It is the old serpent's lie from Eden. Nimrod's subjects would have to ascend up the steps of the mountain for his council. In a city full of low-lying, flat-topped roofs, he would literally be the Most High amongst them, a constant visual reminder to the people of his supremacy. Wherever they were within Babylon and for miles around, they would see the top of the tower and to know that their king and God was keeping a watchful eye over them from heaven, monitoring their every move. This would strike a mixture of fear and awe into his subjects. Nimrod was the initiator of the idea of emperor worship, although it may not have been his idea originally. Evidence suggests that Semiramis was actually the brains behind this concept, and that it was a clever device for helping them keep a tight grip on their subjects. She appeared to understand that a surefire route to gaining earthly honor, prestige and power is through religious authority. Spiritual authority secures temporal authority. Nimrod was more than happy to go along with it, just as Adam was happy to go along with Eve in the Garden of Eden. By turning himself into a god and establishing emperor worship as a common practice, he maintained control over his subjects. Because of his association with fire and the sun, he became known as the sun god. His consort, Semiramis, understandably became associated with the other leading light in the sky, a moon goddess. Around themselves as the sun and moon gods, they created an entire religion that was based on a corruption of primeval astronomy developed by Noah's righteous ancestors prior to the flood. This religion has come to be known as the mystery religion. When we understand that the Tower of Babel was to represent a sacred mountain with a heaven at the top, new light is shed on Genesis 11:4, which to remind you reads, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." When the Bible describes the Tower of Babel as reaching to the heavens, this is often misconstrued as being a reference only to its physical height. The tower would undoubtedly have been the tallest building in the world at that point, but the Babylonians were not attempting to build some kind of structure that would literally reach into outer space. The Bible is simply confirming that it was a temple dedicated to the worship of Nimrod and Semiramis as part of a new satanic religious system. The temple or throne room at the peak of the tower may have been adorned with depictions of the zodiac, but we're talking about a metaphorical heaven rather than a physical one. It was heaven only inasmuch as it was the mountain where the gods of Nimrod and Semiramis sat. Many lesser ziggurats were built in the area and were given names like Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, or Temple which links heaven and earth, or Temple of the Stairway to Pure Heaven. And if that phrase made you think of a Led Zeppelin song, you're on the right track, but we'll get to that later. The Tower of Babel is also the origin of a symbol that almost everyone will be familiar with, particularly in the United States. This is called the all-seeing eye, and it stems from the idea in Babylon that King Nimrod, from his lofty vantage point in heaven, was keeping a watchful eye over everyone. This would strike a mixture of awe and terror into the citizens. There are a number of variations of this symbol. Sometimes we only get the eye within the triangle, other times we see it atop a pyramid-type structure. Occasionally we just get the eye by itself. It all comes from the same source. But again, we must remember the Prince of Tyre, King of Tyre passage from Ezekiel. Satan intended to create a prince in the form of Nimrod through whom he could work out his plans from behind the scenes. The false religious system that Nimrod and Semiramis would establish to direct worship to themselves would by proxy direct worship to Satan as the hidden hand behind it all. Nimrod was a prince of Tyre, a type of Antichrist, who was a mere puppet for the king of Tyre. Therefore, when you see the all-seeing eye, you are not looking at the eye of Nimrod, but the eye of Lucifer or Satan. In everything we look at in this series, we have to remember to keep looking beyond the prince to see the king. Satan uses many vehicles, people, organizations and structures to carry out his plans, but we shouldn't lose sight of the one who is behind them all. If we analyze Genesis 11:4 still further, we can discover more about the tower. Again it says, "Come, let us build ourselves a city, with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves, and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." The first word they say to each other is "come," and this establishes a unity between them. There was a coordination in what they were doing. It was carefully planned and considered, and the project was undertaken in the full knowledge of what it represented. When they say "come" to one another, they are coming together for 4 things. Number 1, to build a city. Number 2, to build a religious temple. Number 3, to glorify themselves or to establish their name or reputation. And number 4, to stop themselves being scattered over the earth. We have already established that the city of Babylon was Nimrod's secular act of defiance against God, a kingdom of man, by man, and for man's glory. We have also already seen that the location is especially significant, as it was built on or near the location of the Garden of Eden, signifying an attempt to return there to create a new Eden, a new humanistic or satanic paradise, separate from God. We have also already established that the tower was a religious temple built in the shape of a sacred mountain from where Nimrod could rule his domain. This brings us to point 3, their intention to make a name for themselves. The English translation again partially masks the true meaning of these words. According to Roger Christopherson, the Hebrew text, "Let us make a great name," reads, "Let us provide our own salvation." In other words, people were attempting to work their way to salvation independently of God. This is the mark of every false religion, the idea that you can provide for or work your way towards glory by your own efforts. Christianity is the only religion whose adherents realize their need for a Savior and their total dependence on Him for salvation. Fourthly and finally, we also read that they were trying to stop from being scattered over the earth. This may appear to be a harmless desire that we should feel sympathy towards, but remember that God's original command to Adam and Eve, which he had reiterated to Noah after the flood, was to multiply and fill the earth. I believe God at least partly gave this command because spreading and diversifying would militate against what Satan was trying to achieve, unity under his false religious system. When the people chose to come together in one location under one system of governance, that was itself an act of rebellion against God, especially since that location was back at Eden, from where man had been expelled. we now need to explore the Babylonian religion of the tower in a little more depth.
Let me just say that what Nimrod did in Genesis chapter 11 will pale in comparison to what the Antichrist will do in the end of days. And we see so many indications that would lead us to believe that that's coming soon. And so we need to be ready. We need to be prepared. I was just getting ready to explain to you on the call of Abraham that somewhere, somehow, living in the midst of paganism, Abraham gained the knowledge of the true God. I'm just going to say this and I'll let you go. Abraham somehow gained knowledge of the true God. You say, well, maybe God just miraculously revealed himself to Abraham. There's only one man that God revealed himself to, and that's Adam. From then on, God has depended on men to tell other men about who he is. It is God's intention that fathers and mothers tell sons and daughters concerning the knowledge of the one true God. And ladies and gentlemen, we have a great responsibility as we approach the end of days. And as we see not just the type and the foreshadow in the picture of what happened in Genesis 11, but when we see that which is pictured actually come into being, which will be a one-world government, a one-world religion, and it will be headed by a man called the Antichrist that Nimrod pictures. I think when we see everything moving in that direction, as I preached from the book of Daniel last year, I think it ought to motivate us to tell others. Amen? And I think it ought to motivate us in the area of trying to be a faithful witness. Next week, we're going to look in detail at the call of Abraham. It is impossible for me to overemphasize the importance of Abraham. It is through Abraham that God establishes two things: a new race of people called the Jews and a new nation called Israel. Now think of it like this, and I'll say this and let you go. This time I mean it. In Genesis 1 through 11, now think about this. In Genesis 1 through 11, we read about creation, the fall of man, the flood of Noah, and the Tower of Babel. How many of y'all would agree with me? Those are four major events. And yet God only consumes 11 chapters in telling us about those four events. But from Genesis 12 to Genesis 50, we learn about Abraham and his descendants and what God called Abraham to do. That ought to tell us something about the importance of Abraham. And so it's impossible to overemphasize the importance of this man. He is literally called the father of our faith.